Testing.
It's been 100 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the war shows no sign of ending. The Red Cross says the scale of destruction defies comprehension. The United Nations estimates more than 4,000 civilians have been killed and nearly 7 million people have left the country, and it's not clear how many soldiers each side has lost. Having failed to take the capital, Kyiv, Russia has scaled back its ambitions and is now fighting for control of Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he remains confident of victory.
It's been 100 days of war. But life in the capital, Kyiv, has returned to a state of relative normality. There are signs of the Russian invasion everywhere. And though people are getting on with life, nobody thinks the war is over.
I think it'll be a long conflict. The war might stop and then start again. I'm preparing for 10 years. I'm not bringing my family back, but I would like to stay in Ukraine myself.
It's like almost normal. Still, I think the danger is still big. So we have a gathering of the troops in the border with Belarus, and anytime it could come back. And also, as everyone in Ukraine, we are under the constant possibility of strike from the air.
A troop build-up in Belarus, just a few hundred kilometres to the north of here, does have people on edge. And though they are trying to make the most of the relative calm here, many fear that Russian successes in the east could embolden Moscow to take another grab at the capital. In Slovyansk, in Ukraine's east, now one of the epicentres of Russia's invasion, war is everywhere. Much of the city has been flattened by Russian strikes.
Is it really necessary to launch this rocket on this house and on this one and the one next door? You tell me that. Let that damn Putin think that Russian missiles are coming. How much does it cost? It costs millions. Is this rocket designed for this house?
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that victory will eventually belong to Ukraine.
The Ukraine armed forces are here. Most importantly, our people are here. We have defended Ukraine for 100 days already. Victory will be ours. Glory to Ukraine.
Even if residents share their president's optimism, here in the Donbass, that promise feels a long way away.
Well, DW correspondent Jan-Philipp Scholz is in Kyiv, and he told me how the conflict stands at the moment.
Things are tense at the moment, especially in the east. President Zelensky says that around 20% of the territory have been occupied by Russia. As you know, after the failed attempt to take over Kyiv at the very beginning of the war, Russians have been focusing on the Donbass region in the east of the country. The Ukrainian forces have had some success there, but most of the territory in the Donbass is in the hands of the Russians by now. And it's a territory where before the war, 15% of Ukrainians lived. And there's still fighting going on in the key city of Severodonetsk. Russians have taken over most of the city, but there's still resistance by the Ukrainian forces.
Now, the last couple of days have seen promises of more heavy weaponry from Western countries, but that's going to take weeks, if not months, to actually arrive. So does that mean things are likely to get worse for Ukraine before they get better?
Well, things might get worse in the coming weeks, yes, but All experts say that the fight also in the Donbas region is far from over. Of course, Ukrainians say that the process of the weapon delivery should be faster, that they should speed up the weapon deliveries, but all sides seem to be prepared for a long war of attrition at the moment.
Husband. He said yes, indeed they were. And he asked me if I was interested in learning and that he would help me, but only if I wanted to. I told him instantly, yes, I want to drive.
It's been 100 days since Russia invaded.
Future counteroffensives by the Ukrainians in the coming weeks and months.
That's Jan-Philipp Scholz in Kyiv. Well, Maria Silichenko has moved back to Kyiv after being evacuated out of the city when the war began. She told me how her family's doing now.
Hi. So my family and I, we were touched by this war a lot because I'm originally from Mariupol and my family lived there for their whole life. So now, of course, we feel, we can't describe how we feel actually, because my grandma was in Mariupol for 3 weeks after, under constant shelling, when it was really the most difficult situation there. And my family, my parents, they lost their home, and now they are in Europe because they can't get back actually to their home city, to Mariupol. And I also left Kiev for almost 3 months, and now I'm back to Kiev because I feel it's my home and I want to be there. But yeah, so I think it's impossible to describe the whole spectrum of the emotions that we have.
And I wonder, while you were away, was it because, of course, the media, there's been wall-to-wall coverage of this. Did you avoid watching what was going on, or were you sort of glued to the set?
We couldn't avoid watching what's going on because, it's my home. It's my nation. It's the people who live in my country, and you can't just get away from that. So we were constantly into all this flow of the news and what's going on because we want to help our country, and we try to do whatever we could do in order to get the situation just a bit better. And we want to win, all of us. So that's why we can't get away from that.
And now you're back in Kyiv. How does that feel? Do you feel safe?
Personally, I feel relatively safe in Kiev. Of course, we have regular air raid sirens, each day. Of course, there is a gas shortage, and in order to fill the tank, you need to wait, 2, 3, 4 hours sometimes to get the gas actually. But it's my home, and there are more and more people coming back to Kiev. Unfortunately, many people with kids, they can't get back because still it's not safe. So they are staying in Europe or in western part of Ukraine. But when I get back to Kiev, I realized that, it's the place where I belong, and I would be there for the future.
And you mentioned your grandmother. You said that she was in Mariupol, which of course is now under Russian control. Have you heard from her?
Yeah, finally we met after 3 months of war, and we evacuated her from the occupied territory. Now she's in the Kiev region. And when we met, it was such a relief to see her healthy, to see that she's happy to be with us, to be in Ukraine. And when she started to describe all the horrors that she survived through when she was in Mariupol, I just cried, literally. So it's a difficult time for us, but now we are together.
Okay, we wish you well. I'm glad that that happened, isn't it?
Hi. Okay. Good. Hello, everyone. Good morning here from Seoul. And okay, so today's a holiday, so I can't count on the staff being available to open up the computers and everything. I don't really know if they're on or not. So I was told that we can do things from my office. So so here we are meeting, and hopefully you can hear me well. And of course, your midterm, your final exam papers, first drafts were due Saturday. So if you were late in getting those in, I will look at those over the week But like you, I've got my own deadlines and conferences coming up, and I have my own homework to do as well. So I'm working on that as well. So I will get those late papers through the week. And speaking of the final exam papers, I also sent out a notification to you to sign up for a conference session. So to discuss your papers. So let me make sure I'm sharing the screen here, and go to share screen and here, and then click on Drive. And so you can see I uploaded, with the midterm paper, a conference session for you to meet with me to discuss your final exam papers beginning next week and continue on. So please go there and choose a time to. You can see some students have signed up, so please do that, and we will discuss the papers individually. Okay, and so now let's go. Let me close that and go to the Cyber Campus site and make sure that you're able to see this. So we go to share screen and here, and we click on add. And so your smart attendance number is 679. 679 is your smart attendance number. So let me go back to the chat function there and put in 679. 679 is your smart attendance number. Okay, so and so this is the last chapter in the textbook, and so let's in our short class today. So let's go through the those notes. There's lots to talk about, of course, given of course the conflict in Ukraine and in Russia and nationalism, and but let's also make sure that we cover the material that's in the book. And also the lesson plan. We have a debate. It's Sarah versus me on Friday. To South Koreans, the European Union will eventually become, in reality, the United States of Europe. And so that's been something like of a theme throughout the whole semester. So we will wrap that up on Friday with a nice debate. And okay, so let's look at the notes for the chapter that I posted. And so make sure I open up those notes. And by the way, if you can't see something, if I forget to share a screen, please let me know so that I can make sure that I remember to share the screen so you can see the notes that I'm presenting. So let me again go to share screen and here, and so you can see. Here is chapter 19 of the textbook, and I think you can hear me pretty well, right? So, all right. So, EU enlargement has always been distinct from the deepening of EU integration. That's what the editors of your book argue, or Bomer and Lekesny, and it says here, after the Croatia's accession in 2013, which is already 9 years ago, enlargement has slipped further down the European Union's list of priorities. Of course, a big theme in the semester so far, of course, is how rapidly Europe is changing, along with the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. And Ukraine is pressing to join the European Union again, much more intensely, given that it's in war. And I think one of the arguments that the European authorities are making about joining the European Union is that the Ukrainian people are so mobilized in fighting this war against the Russian invader that Ukraine and Ukrainian mobilization capability of the Ukrainian public to carry out the far-reaching necessary reforms that are necessary for any country to join the European Union. I mean, they have to basically, these former communist countries, they have to revolutionize their societies in a liberal democratic direction. They have to change the economies, the political system, their cultural policy, their education policy, everything that is a topic of government policy is touched by the European integration. And one of the big problems for countries of Eastern Europe is that some countries are much slower in carrying out the necessary reforms that they need to carry out, as overseen by the European Commission. When they apply to join the European Union, they have to make substantial progress and show the ability to implement these very far-reaching reforms, go beyond simply adopting them through the parliaments of their countries, but to actually implement them within the society. That means you have to have an effective bureaucracy, you have to have a mobilized bureaucracy, you have to have a court system. These bureaucrats and judicial officials, they have to be honest and accountable. In other words, not take bribes when their salaries are often not very good or very low as state government officials. And there's all sorts of illegal business going on, lots of rich criminals who are willing to bribe or try to bribe government officials, including judges and bureaucrats, and also threaten to kill them if these judges and bureaucrats and civil servants do not do what they want these criminals to do, what these criminals want them to do, I should say. So you have to demonstrate an ability to not only adopt these policies through your Bulgarian parliament or your Polish parliament, but actually implement them. And the European Commission relies upon a number of different actors, including non-governmental organizations, civil society groups that are really excited more or less about Europeanization, to give reports to the European Commission, to the European Union bodies about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the Bulgarian state to carry out reforms, for example, in the form of its civil service. And it's of course, some countries have been more mobilized and more effective and capable than others. And of course, I assume if you're a small country like Lithuania or Latvia and Estonia with 2 or 3 million people, right, it might be a little bit easier to carry out reforms than if you're a bigger country like Poland with almost 40 million people, or Romania with 27 million people. But some countries have done better, had done more at implementing these European Union requirements to join the European Union, to continue to make progress after joining the European Union, because, let's face it, these countries, not just in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe, they often fall short in various degrees and various ways from the goals and targets that the European Union has set. But they're supposed to be making progress, right? They're supposed to be making progress to meeting the Stability and Growth Pact obligations, for example, right? That all of the countries that are in the Eurozone, they're not supposed to have more than 3% of their gross domestic product as a budget deficit size any year, that their government should not be spending more than 3% of deficit spending as a percentage of their gross domestic product. Of course, so often these countries, including France, including Germany, they don't meet that, but they're supposed to make progress towards that. So you're supposed to demonstrate progress. And some countries have done better in meeting these goals and objectives and indicating to the observers that are watching them that they're really committed to implementing European reforms. And let's face it, some countries have done better than others. Like, for example, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were 3 former Soviet republics in the 15 Soviet republics, right, that made up the Soviet Union. These countries that were part of the Russian Empire, then broke away after World War I, that were reconquered by Stalin during World War II. And they're in the Eurozone. Not only are they in NATO and the European Union, but they're also in the Eurozone. And of course, they have especially strong collective incentives to carry out these reforms, right? Because they're former Soviet republics, not so much Lithuania, but Latvia and Estonia. About 1/3 of the populations in those small countries are Russians who moved there, mostly moved there during the communist period, because they have military bases there, naval bases, other military bases. And so Russian soldiers and their families moved there and stayed there. And they're concerned that, if Putin moves against Ukraine and Georgia, that he might move against, or the Moscow might threaten Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So they have collective incentives to move forward and carry out economic reforms. And also the European Union authorities have strong incentives to view their efforts kindly and positively. You see, that's a theme I want to emphasize here, right? When we talk about in international relations, trying to explain anything like the enlargement of the European Union, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, any foreign policy issue, any foreign international relations event, we need to look at levels of factors that are causing these developments on three different levels, right? There's what Vladimir Putin or Olaf Scholz want, as decision makers of countries, or Emmanuel Macron, the individual level of analysis. Then there's also what we call the state level of analysis, like what's going on collectively within those countries. How nationalistic are they? How effective is their economic investment? How well are the economy is doing? What kind of ethnic conflicts, minority versus majority, all these societies are different. But those collective level characteristics and factors and trends are really important for explaining a country's behavior and its ability of its government in the form of individuals to carry out their promises. And then, of course, there's the international system level. That's the third level, right? I talked about this in previous class, right? About the need to talk about any causation of anything in international relations, the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the US attack on Iraq in 2003, or the start of World War II. You need to talk about factors of causation, all three levels of analysis, and show how they relate to each other. And one of the problems with Ukraine's, and not just Ukraine, but particularly Ukraine's efforts to move towards the integration with the West, was that not only was it the fact that they were a very corrupt country with terrible corruption problems, so it's very difficult for the government to actually implement policies it promised to implement. Even if it wanted to adopt those policies and implement them, it was very difficult to actually see progress because the judges and the civil servants were so ineffective. The judicial system and the civil service is so ineffective in Ukraine, and for a lot of reasons, including the Russia versus Ukrainian ethnic conflicts, the ideological conflicts, class conflicts, but not just to mention Russia's resistance to Ukraine joining NATO and the European Union, although that was also obviously very, very important. But now with Ukraine at war, we see that Ukrainian nationalism has become much more intense, and supposedly this is motivating Ukraine to be much more collectively capable in carrying out, implementing its policy obligations to try to join the European Union and implement its obligations if it were to become a member of the European Union, in terms of the tens of thousands of pages of laws that the European Union has already adopted since it began in 1952 under the European Coal and Steel Community. Tens of thousands of pages of laws that any country seeking to join the European Union has to adopt and implement. But also another important factor, the individual levels of leaders on those countries, they've always been pro-European Union since Yanukovych fled in 2014, 8 years ago. The former president of Ukraine, who was pro-Russian, who fled the Maidan 2014 Euromaidan protests in Kyiv. They've all been pro-European Union, but they faced all these domestic context factors limiting their ability to act. But now also, aside from the war and this wartime emergency situations, with terrible war happening, it's seeing thousands of casualties and deaths, Ukrainian nationalism intensifying, that also the Western actors, the international system level, meaning London, meaning Washington, meaning Berlin, meaning Paris, that their perception of Ukraine is now moving in a direction where they see more of a problem with Moscow, obviously, more of a problem with Russia. And, as we talked about in the previous classes, right, in terms of motivated reasoning and psychological balancing, people tend to engage in this process of seeing somebody in a more positive light if they are seen as an ally against an increasingly dangerous common threat. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so more and more people are willing to tolerate Ukraine and accept Ukraine's problems because we have a bigger problem, and that bigger problem is Putin's Moscow. And this is not the first time this happened. I already told you, right? Back when Greece was applying to join the European community back in the 1970s and 1980s, it eventually joined in the 1980s, but the European Commission said Greece is not ready. Economically, they haven't carried out the necessary reforms that Greece needs to carry out. successfully, fully, that they need to carry out to be able to deal with and carry out their obligations as a member of the European community. The European Commission said that, but the member states of the European community at that time decided that they must bring Greece into the European community because they wanted to stabilize this new, young, democratic regime that came to power in the midst of the humiliation over Cyprus, with the Cold War still going on, sharing a border with communism, with communist Bulgaria, that they had to be brought in, even though they hadn't carried out the necessary economic reforms in the view of the European Commission. So this is nothing new. So, you know, the book is written 3 years ago, and it's describing how European expansion and enlargement has seemed to stall, right? With Croatia came in 2013, and then, you know, with dealing with the financial crisis and the rise of Euroscepticism, even Emmanuel Macron a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, after he got elected the first time, said, you know, we're going to wait on expanding the European Union. And he's particularly referring to the Balkan countries, the remaining Balkan countries like Serbia, like Albania, like North Macedonia, and because he was appealing or responding to growing Euroscepticism in countries like France and other countries where political parties are emerging, claiming that, you know, we're making it too easy for poor people to come to our country and take our jobs because they'll work for much lower wages, and they're going to come and take the way and lower the wages for people that live in France because they're willing to work at much lower levels, the wage levels, these Polish plumbers or these Albanian plumbers, right? But now we have this regional and global emergency with this war in Ukraine, and so reminding us of the role of the international system level, also shaping the internal environments within Germany, within France, also within the United States and elsewhere, to now seriously consider more seriously enlargement of the European Union. So we'll see if this crisis, again, with a new form of the Cold War with Moscow, will lead to it already is leading to renewed calls for continuing the enlargement of the European Union, like, for example, as I mentioned, to Northern Macedonia or and Albania, and but also to Ukraine. And we'll see if the European Union is going to be willing to move more in that direction in response to this supposed perceived threat, intensifying dangerous threat from Putin's Moscow. Even if it is based upon mutual perception of fear, misperception of fear and threat, still there is this emerging perception in Europe that Moscow is a problem, a serious problem. So much so that, for example, even Sweden and Finland, 2 countries that are not members of NATO, have now applied to join NATO, even though they're already members of the European Union. So that's an important point to keep in mind, right? That the European enlargement, the European integration process has always been shaped by also international system level trends and developments. The Cold War, the collapse of the Cold War, the emergence of a new Cold War now with Moscow, the rise of China, the decline of the United States, that these have also shaped the internal trends of Europeanization within the European community and the European Union, have been shaped by the international systemic level factors. Okay, so so we'll see. I mean, again, you know, you can say, well, how can Ukraine come into the European Union when 20% of its territory is now occupied by Russia, according to the news report I was just showing you at the beginning of today's class? That's a good point, but maybe, of course, in some kind of crisis response of a way to bring about a ceasefire, that somehow I could imagine a scenario. It's just imagining, speculating a scenario, right? That somehow to generate a ceasefire, that the European Union uses that possibility of joining the European Union to persuade the Ukrainian nationalists to accept a ceasefire, even though they lost 20% of the territory of their post-Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The borders of Ukraine that were set when it was part of the Soviet Union became the boundaries or territorial boundaries of the post-Soviet, post-communist Ukrainian state. They've lost 20% of that territory. To persuade them to a ceasefire in return to what's left of Ukraine, the other 80% or whatever, to join the European Union. The problem is, I don't think the Russians are going to stop. I mean, again, this is all speculating and inferring the future. I mean, I think they want more of Ukraine. I think they want all of the Black Sea coast. I mean, if you're a Russian nationalist, being able to tolerate the loss of Kiev, not to mention, Odessa, for example. Odessa is a modern Ukrainian city, beautiful city on the Black Sea. It was founded by Catherine the Great, one of the great Russian monarchs at the end of the 18th century. It was part of the Imperial Russian Empire. It was called Novaya Russia, New Russia, that part of the northern coast of the Black Sea that Russia conquered in the 18th century and annexed to the Russian Empire. It was called Novaya Russia, New Russia. So Odessa looks a bit like, I guess, like Washington, D.C. or St. Petersburg. These are modern cities that were planned as modern cities. So Odessa is a beautiful city, right? But so for Russian nationalists just to accept that they're not going to get back Odessa, or Kiev, right? Or even Kiev. So I'm not so certain that Russia would agree to a ceasefire. Hopefully you try to persuade them to agree to a ceasefire. If not, this is going to get worse and worse and worse. As the Russian economy becomes worse and worse and worse, you're going to see Russian nationalism become more and more intense to compensate for the loss of economic well-being, that the Russian nationalism become even more intense than it already is, and try to go for, I guess, partitioning of Ukraine and taking everything, at least everything to the east of the Dnieper River that runs through the middle of the country, and adding it to Russia. That's an important point to keep in mind in international relations, international politics. Things are bad, but they can always be worse. They can always get worse. And that's a point to keep in mind. This situation in Ukraine can get exponentially worse than it already is, with 12 million people displaced, 6 or 7 million people leaving Ukraine to go to other countries. This could get much worse than it already is. So I can imagine how the European Union tries to somehow persuade Ukrainian nationalists to accept a ceasefire with the loss basically of 20% of the territory of Ukraine. I don't know if it'll work. And I'm not certain that the Russian regime will accept it, that they will accept the ceasefire. Because Putin and the Russian government are also pressured by Russian nationalism. As I told you, you cannot understand public opinion unless you understand nationalism in the modern era. And public opinion constrains leaders. It constrains Emmanuel Macron. It constrains Joe Biden. It constrains Vladimir Putin. It constrains Volodymyr Zelensky. It constrains Yoon Suk Yeol here in South Korea. But that's a scenario where, and again, there's precedent, for example, where Cyprus, for example, is now in the European Union, even though Turkey still continues to occupy the top third of that island. Since 1974, they've been there, and Cyprus joined the European Union. So there's a precedent. And of course, everybody would point that out. There is a precedent for a country being brought into the European Union when part of it's under foreign occupation. But I mean, the point is somehow we got to stop the fighting. And I'm not certain that this is really so much under the control of Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, because I said, Ukrainian nationalism is an independent factor here. When an independent factor, it's not something that Zelensky of Ukraine can turn on and off when he wants to. He wanted to make a deal with Russia, but he was constrained after he got elected 3 years ago, he was constrained by Ukrainian nationalists. He couldn't compromise. So, I mean, this is a very fluid, dynamic situation we're in that could get much, much more violent than it already is. And, and then there are indications that the French, for example, know that, right? I mean, there was a statement by a French official. Let me see if I can find that article. I downloaded it here. I think I put it here. Did I put it here? Maybe put it in another file. I wasn't really gonna. Yeah, I put it. Let me open it. I think I put it in another file. Let me open it up. I think it's worth showing, just to show you that this is the kind of dynamics and discussions we're having right now in this very dangerous, very fluid situation that we're confronting right now, where this is the report, right? From a high-level advisor to Emmanuel Macron is calling upon the Ukrainians not to humiliate Russia, right? As battle rages, Ukraine rejects Macron plea not to humiliate Russia. Humiliate Russia, this is from a top advisor to President Macron of France. He just won re-election. This advisor said, oh no, this is Macron, sorry. We must not humiliate Russia so that the day when the fighting stops, we can build an exit ramp through the diplomatic means. Macron, who has sought to position himself as the world's chief negotiator with the Kremlin, said in an interview with French newspapers, "I am convinced that France roles to be a mediating power." And of course, the Ukrainian government reacted very hostilely to that. Humiliate Russia? What do you mean humiliate Russia? You can't appease this aggressive Russian fascist regime. They use this term, Russian fascist regime, Rushist, fascist, and Russian fascist, Rushist comes up in the media reports out of Ukraine to describe what's going on. And so they're saying, we're not going to compromise. We're making progress. We destroyed almost the entire 35th All-Russian Army, President Zelensky said. We don't want to compromise. We're going to fight until victory. So again, this kind of statement from Macron indicates, again, like we talked about earlier in the class, right? This kind of statement implies that Russia's use of deadly force is due to perceived threat, that Russia is being humiliated, dismembered. It's not that Russia wants to conquer Europe, or at least the Soviet Union, that Russia feels, Russia perceives a threat to Russia's dignity and Russia's unity and Russia's identity. I'm not saying that justifies Russia's behavior, but that's different from viewing Russia's use of deadly force as being built by a desire to recreate the Russian Empire in the old Soviet Union. So, and so I could imagine, as we, and again, this is one of the benefits of teaching. I'm allowed to try to think through some thoughts in my head by expressing them to you here, to try to understand what's going on insofar as how European integration, which is supposed to be a peace strategy for Europe, since one could argue made some big mistakes here insofar as basically the European Union being seen as, one side of NATO coin, right? European Union, NATO, NATO, European Union, that if you're going to try to bring peace to Europe, what role can the European Union play now in 2022, in June 2022? And I'm sure somebody's suggesting that we have to try to get the Ukrainians to accept the ceasefire, of course, but they'll never do it publicly, right? You can't make this a public proposal because, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky risks being overthrown if he says, well, let's accept that we lost 20% of our territory. He's got to have some kind of benefit that he can give back to the Ukrainian people. Otherwise, this war is going to drag on and on and on and become much, much worse and could expand by accident. In particular, for example, if one of these Russian missiles, for example, flies across the border and blows up in Poland, and then NATO has to respond because Russia blew up something in Poland. So, yes, as battle rages, Ukraine rejects Macron plea not to humiliate Russia. And if you're a Ukrainian nationalist, you probably can't believe your ears or believe your eyes. Humiliate Russia? What are you talking about? They invaded us. They're killing thousands of our people, committing atrocities, killing and raping. Humiliate Russia? Okay, but let's go back to the notes. And just to highlight that, well, Ella's asking, is nuclear war more likely now since the longer the war? I think Ella, that the typical way to understand what's going on now is that the concern is that a war with the West would happen through accidents, right? So you see this, for example, President Joe Biden is saying publicly to everybody, to the newspapers, to the television, we're only going to give weapons to Ukraine that have a firing range, artillery guns that have a firing range that are not too long. So they can't use those artillery guns. Ukrainians cannot use those American artillery guns to fire into Russian territory, across the border into Russia. So they're giving them some weapon system that has a range of like 50 miles. Of course, if you push the Russians back, I don't know what that means. You could still fire a 50-mile artillery piece across the border to Russia. But there's this concern that basically, if the Russians kill somebody on the Polish side of the border, or the Lithuanian or Latvian or Estonian side of the border, or somebody in the Romanian side of the border, the countries that belong to NATO, that NATO has to respond. They're not just going to let Russia blow something up in Poland and then NATO not take action, because then they're concerned about deterrence and credibility and deterrence. You use deadly force against a NATO country, NATO has to respond. So they'll blow up probably the Russian missile site that sent that missile into Polish territory, even if it was done by accident. And accidents happen all the time in war, all the time. And it's not, maybe the Russians commit more, but the Americans commit a lot all of the time. You just saw it when they left Afghanistan, right? Last August, when they thought somebody was getting ready to car bomb them and they killed a whole family by, oops, accident. Oh, they happen all the time. Sooner or later, they will happen. Some Russian missile is going to blow up on NATO territory. Or an artillery shell is going to blow up on NATO territory. Or some Russian fighter jet is going to fire a missile at some unit that is still on Polish military asset that's still on Polish territory. And then NATO has to respond by shooting down that plane, and now you got Russians and NATO people killing each other, not just Ukrainians and Russians and NATO people killing each other. So, I mean, how do we resolve this? I'm not certain we know how to resolve this. I mean, insofar, for example, you have to make some kind of, I mean, not speaking as you, I'm not Ukrainian, right? But I would want to believe, that doesn't make it true, but I would want to believe that the Ukrainians really want to join the European Union. At least Ukrainian nationalists, they desperately want to get in the European Union, right? And then be European by joining the European Union. And that's going to be attractive to a lot of people. There's some people in Ukraine, some constituency group that will refuse that. We were not going to give up any Ukrainian territory for any reason. Until we win. And I don't know what to do about those people. Do you use the army against them? Do you use force to suppress them? If you're Zelensky, do you abolish Ukrainian democracy to put those groups down? They're a small, probably, well, I don't know how big they are. They probably become bigger as people become more furious about the atrocities and violence by Russia against Ukrainians. I'm not saying this is easy, Ella. And that's the horror of war. As it goes on and more people die, fear, hatred, contempt, disgust become more and more powerful collectively, individually and collectively in the country's collective mindset, and that means stereotyping, and that means narrow thinking, focusing only on certain objectives, focusing only on zero-sum thinking. It's like what happened in World War II. There were opportunities to negotiate with the Nazi regime in Germany when they started losing the war, but the Americans and the British refused to come up with any kind of settlement. And of course, the Soviets as well refused to come up with any kind of settlement. So they continued to fight that war, and tens of more millions of people would die. And then the communist regime would be installed in Eastern Europe for 40 years as a consequence of the failure to bring about a ceasefire. And it's a consequence of nationalism. People become more and more emotional, and stereotype more and more intensely, it becomes increasingly difficult. If you're Volodymyr Zelensky, even if you want to make a deal, you can't and keep your job. You try to make a deal and you'll be overthrown, or worse. You'll be called a traitor, a compromiser, an appeaser. Because there are certainly Ukrainian nationalists who think that they can win. And they're willing to keep fighting. And those people, they don't necessarily want a ceasefire, but they're not all Ukrainians, but they're a really motivated minority of Ukrainians. That's the thing about nationalists. They tend to dominate the political system because they're so motivated. You know, the worst charge you can level against anybody is to be called a traitor. You want to give up territory to those evil Russians, to the orcs of Mordor? You're a traitor. They use those terms, by the way. I came across a speech Zelensky gave. If any of you are interested, you know, there's a nice website I go to. I don't think you can get it here at Catholic University of Korea, though. It's at the ProQuest Central. So if you go here and you type in, let me see if I can show you what I spend a big chunk of my day looking at here. ProQuest Central, you go here and you go to publications and you look up BBC Monitoring Service. And BBC Monitoring Service is this nice daily report put out by the BBC of its survey of media. What the hell happened here? It's supposed to, let me see if I can find it like this. Okay, sorry. So you go here and you can see former Soviet Union, and they come up with these daily reports. And so this is for yesterday, right? And so far they only got 17 reports up. So the BBC looks through the websites, monitors Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian television, and it translates into English the text of the news reports, the websites, the television broadcasts. And Zelensky, you know, he says, you know, I guess the Ukrainians today label Russia Mordor. I read that yesterday in one of his speech that he gave on Ukrainian television. He gives a speech, I guess, every night to the Ukrainian people, right? So it's interesting again how pop culture, pop entertainment is being used in current discourse in this deadly war going on, so this is, but this, of course, the BBC covers more than just the former Soviet Union. It also covers, you know, if you go back to publication information, if you have access to ProQuest Central, which your public library may have in the United States, I don't know. This library doesn't have it anymore here because it's too expensive, evidently, and not enough people are using it. But I have my own individual access to it. So you can see BBC monitoring, daily monitoring, Africa economic, you know, London, North and South America, Asia Pacific. So if I were going to, you know, follow what's going on in North Korea, I would click here and I would say, you know, Pyongyang. Well, let's see. Yeah, program summary, North Korean radio. So again, translated into English, if you want to know what North Korean radio was saying yesterday. And but again, just to show you that this is something that is nice to have. I mean, it's really, you can get your own subscription to it, but it's really expensive. And it is available, and many libraries, at least in the United States, have access to BBC monitoring if they have ProQuest. Okay, but back to this. I don't know, will Putin be overthrown? I feel like he either accepts the ceasefire. Again, I mean, the mistakes that were being made were made long ago. I mean, I think when Lady Catherine Ashton, the first High Representative of the Europeans' Common Foreign Security Policy under the Treaty of Lisbon, went to the fall 2013 Maidan demonstrations protesting against President Viktor Yanukovych of Ukraine's refusal to sign an association agreement with the European Union. When she went there in a big coat and went out into the street and clapped and shook hands with all the protesters, that was the first mistake that the European Union made. in getting the Russians and to believe that basically there's no separation between the European Union and the United States. Okay, given that, where we are today, there needs to be some kind of deal made, about, there needs to be territorial compromises in Ukraine. And for example, we all know Russia is not going to give up Crimea. Even Zelensky knows that. He made a statement that he would be willing to consider going back to the situation before the start of the Russian invasion on February 24th, when Russia was already occupying part of the Donbass and Crimea. And then he came under pressure and attack from Ukrainian nationals saying, no, no. And then he sort of backed away and is not talking about that anymore. But they know, I mean, because Crimea, again, to Ella, Crimea is to Russians what the Alamo in Texas is to Americans. And it was given to, Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in the early 1950s as sort of a gift to Ukraine under the Communist Party of the Soviet Union because of how much Ukraine suffered under Stalin. And it didn't mean anything at the time because it was all part of the Soviet Union. I mean, it wasn't a big nationalist scandal because it was all part of the Soviet Union. So we all know this. And so even the West and even Ukrainians accept that Crimea is Russian. So we already established the precedent that the territorial boundaries of Ukraine, as they were inherited in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed 31 years ago, that's not the final say of where the boundaries have to be. There are people in Ukraine that do not accept that, but the predominant view in Washington, even in Kiev, even if they don't come out and say it, is that has been established. That those boundaries, this is very difficult to say, right? But like Crimea is not going back to Ukraine after Russia took it in 2014. So how much other territory is not going back to Ukraine? Just Donetsk and Luhansk? Will Russian nationalists accept just Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea? Or will they go for Odessa, not to mention Kiev, the mother of Russian cities? I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying, and I definitely know it's getting more and more difficult as more and more people die and people become more and more emotional and more hateful and wanting to settle this on a battlefield. And that will, in this, but other people are saying it looks like this war is going to go on and on and on. It's been over 100 days and it'll go another 100 days. But again, the longer it goes on, aside from the suffering of people in Ukraine with these atrocities and killings and death, as I said, accidents inevitably happen. They always eventually happen. And now we got possible escalation between nuclear powers. I mean, again, it doesn't take much from some Russian missile to go off track and blow up in Poland. I mean, I saw it when I was in Bulgaria, right? When NATO was bombing Serbia over Kosovo in 1999. NATO, I think an American military aircraft fired an anti-radar missile at a Serbian radar site that was used to try to track American warplanes. And this American anti-radar missile homed in on the Sofia, Bulgaria airport traffic control radar. And it flew into Bulgaria. And it crashed in Bulgaria. Now, I don't know if the bomb went, I don't think the bomb went off. I think it just destroyed somebody's apartment. It destroyed somebody's house in a village, but it didn't kill anybody. And that's the Americans. Because the Sofia, Bulgaria air traffic control radar still used old Soviet technology like the Serbs did. Yeah, I mean, that's what someone would say, just let them fight until they both accept that there's a hurting stalemate, right? That they're paying more, it costs more to keep fighting than if agree to a ceasefire. And how did they get to that point? I mean, that point is in their minds, right? In terms of, it's a combination of understanding their perceptions of the motivations of their enemies, their own relative capabilities. And these factors are shaped by nationalism and emotion, not just what America and Poland and the rest of NATO do. It's affected by politics within Moscow, within Kyiv, within Washington, and the different groups and constituencies fighting and struggling with each other there. But if you're Russia, if you're the European Union, and this class is about the European Union, I think the most important overriding objective is to get a ceasefire, and it's not easy at this point. What is going to be Russia's benefit for getting a ceasefire? You want Russia to stop fighting? What are you going to give them? You want Ukraine to stop fighting? What are you going to give them? Offer them EU membership? Offer Russia the removal of their sanctions off Russia, even after they've killed thousands and thousands of Ukrainians so far? Just say, well, we just want a ceasefire, remove the sanctions off them, the economic sanctions off Russia. Is that easy to do? How is Joe Biden going to sell that in Washington against his enemies and adversaries when he's got elections coming up in November and then in 2024? And this is true for all the democratically elected governments in Europe and elsewhere. Russia's been called evil, horrible, and now you're going to agree to let them keep the part of Ukraine they've taken, 20% of the territory, de facto through a ceasefire? How long did it take for China and the US to reach a ceasefire in Korea after China intervened at the end of 1950? They fought another 3 years, or 2.5 years at least, before they could agree to a ceasefire. They reached a hurting stalemate. Do we have to fight for another 3 years in Ukraine before they reach a mutually shared perception of a hurting stalemate? Maybe. Public opinion, it constrains leaders as well as it empowers them. But I mean, it's just. But these are the kinds of terms that we have. I mean, I would suggest, I would just speculate, getting a ceasefire is most important. Is it going to be feasible or possible? Ukrainian government is saying, no, we're starting to win. We launched a counteroffensive in Kherson. Just give us more weapons. Just keep supplying the weapons. We'll keep fighting. We'll do the fighting and dying. You just give us guns against the Mordor and orcs. And who can say no? Can Joe Biden say no? He might want to say no, but then he's thinking about what the Republicans are going to say leading up to the November elections against him and the Democrats. So everybody's constrained by nationalist public opinion, more or less here. And if the European Union is going to break with the United States over making a ceasefire accommodation with Russia, it would be a landmark event. That basically there's a split between Washington and Paris and Berlin. Paris and Berlin, Brussels, let's just say Brussels, they agree to make some kind of deal with Russia over Ukraine that the Americans don't like, or at least groups in America are not going to like. But that means the European Union then has to back them up and develop their own capacities independent or separate from NATO. And that would be a major step that they have not shown a willingness to do so far since this war started in February. And then and somehow some kind of incentives to Ukraine to beginning the accession process. You might even offer Russia some kind of negotiations for a free trade agreement with the European Union. And that might sound like a feasible way to give them something. But again, politically, is it feasible when for the last 100 days, Russia is being portrayed as this evil, aggressive force that carries out murders and atrocities and killings of men and raping of women, and oh my God, you're going to now give them a free trade agreement with the European Union? Or okay, maybe not that far, but remove the economic sanctions on them that have been put on Russia since February? Is that politically feasible? And not political suicide for a government that does it or attempts to do it? But these are the kind of hard conversations we have to have. Okay, so I've gone off on a tangent on our short class here. So not a tangent, I think it is really important, right? Because the European Union is supposed to be a peace strategy. And so now it's being tested. It failed, I think, in my view, and it's only my view, it failed 8 years ago. They should not have gotten involved in that. They should not have sent Lady Catherine Ashton to go on the streets and applaud those demonstrators protesting against the democratically elected government president of Ukraine, who was balancing all these conflicting forces, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, within this country to decide not to sign an association agreement. Okay, the European Union could have said that was unfortunate, bad, but why did they have to send Lady Catherine Ashton onto the streets with the protesters? And John McCain, the senator from the United States, went there also. Yay, protesters! Encouraging the protesters, escalating tensions in Ukraine. Then eventually the Ukrainian police fired on the protesters, killed 100 of them, and then Yanukovych ran away and is living somewhere in Russia. And then Russia, and then of course, the new president, leaders of Ukraine, restarted negotiations with the European Union. And that's when Putin and Moscow began to annex Crimea and encourage the uprising in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. Okay, that's all for today. Well, see you for the debate on Friday with me and Sarah.